April 1951. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sits before Congress and says something that will end Douglas MacArthur's legendary career. The man who commanded American forces in the Pacific during World War II, who accepted Japan's surrender, who engineered the impossible Incheon landing, is about to be fired by President Truman. And Bradley, his fellow five-star general, is about to explain why. What Bradley says is not just about MacArthur. It's about the difference between military genius and strategic madness, between courage and recklessness, between winning wars and starting World War III. His words are measured, devastating, and historically defining. MacArthur wanted to expand the war, bomb China, use nuclear weapons, and risk global catastrophe to win in Korea. Bradley looks at the same situation and sees something completely different. What he says in that moment defines the limits of American military power and establishes that even legendary generals can be wrong when they push too far. If you want to see more moments when MacArthur's vision collided with reality, subscribe now. The conflict between MacArthur and the Truman administration has been building for months, but it reaches breaking point in March and April 1951. MacArthur has been publicly contradicting administration policy, making statements to the press that undermine diplomatic efforts to negotiate an end to the Korean War, and advocating for military strategies that President Truman and his advisors believe would trigger World War III. The final straw comes when MacArthur sends a letter to Republican Congressman Joseph Martin criticizing the administration's limited war strategy and arguing that there is no substitute for victory. When Martin reads the letter on the House floor, making MacArthur's opposition to official policy completely public, Truman decides that MacArthur must be relieved of command. But firing MacArthur is not simple political decision. MacArthur is national hero with enormous public support. His military record is legendary. His confidence and bold decision-making saved South Korea from communist conquest. The Incheon landing demonstrated strategic brilliance that few commanders in history could match. Dismissing him will create political firestorm and require powerful justification. Truman needs the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military authority in the country, to support the decision. If they stand with MacArthur, the president cannot proceed. If they stand with Truman, MacArthur's dismissal becomes necessary military decision rather than political vendetta. Omar Bradley, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, becomes the key figure in this confrontation. Bradley is MacArthur's peer in rank, both holding five-star general status. But Bradley's temperament and approach to strategy are completely different from MacArthur's. Where MacArthur is bold, theatrical, and certain of his own genius, Bradley is cautious, analytical, and willing to acknowledge uncertainty. Where MacArthur sees warfare as arena for decisive action and total victory, Bradley understands war as extension of policy that must serve broader strategic objectives, even when that means accepting unsatisfying outcomes. The contrast between them represents fundamental disagreement about what military power can and should accomplish. Bradley reviews MacArthur's recommendations for expanding the Korean War and concludes they are strategically catastrophic. MacArthur wants to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, blockade the Chinese coast, and potentially use nuclear weapons to offset Chinese numerical superiority. He argues that fighting limited war with self-imposed restrictions is prolonging the conflict and getting American soldiers killed unnecessarily. His logic is that if the war is worth fighting, it should be fought to win with every available weapon. But Bradley sees different calculation. Expanding the war to China risks Soviet intervention under their Mutual Defense Treaty. It would tie down American forces in massive Asian land war while leaving Europe vulnerable to Soviet attack. Most importantly, it would mean fighting the wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong enemy. When Bradley testifies before Congress in May 1951 to explain the administration's decision to relieve MacArthur, his statement includes the phrase that will define the entire controversy. He says that MacArthur's strategy would involve the United States in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. These words are not spontaneous rhetoric. They represent Bradley's carefully considered strategic assessment that MacArthur's recommendations, however logical from purely military perspective, ignore political and strategic realities that make expanding the Korean War unacceptably dangerous. Bradley's statement becomes the official military justification for firing the most famous general in America. The fundamental disagreement between Bradley and MacArthur is about what victory means and what price is acceptable to achieve it. MacArthur believes that wars should be fought to win decisively. His entire career has been built on bold action and total commitment. He sees the Korean War as test of American resolve against communist expansion. Accepting stalemate or limited objectives means signaling weakness that will encourage further communist aggression throughout Asia. In MacArthur's worldview, the political restrictions that prevent bombing China or using nuclear weapons are not prudent restraint, but failure of will that gets more soldiers killed by prolonging conflicts unnecessarily. Bradley's vision of victory is more complex and less emotionally satisfying. He understands that the United States is engaged in global Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. Korea is one theater in this larger struggle, and decisions about Korea must consider effects on American strategic position globally. Expanding the war to China would commit American military resources to Asian land war, while the real strategic threat, the Soviet Union, remains focused on Europe. It would alienate allies who fear American aggression might trigger World War III. It would potentially give Stalin an excuse to intervene openly, turning Korean conflict into direct superpower confrontation with nuclear stakes. From Bradley's perspective, accepting limited objectives in Korea serves larger strategic purpose of containing communism without risking global catastrophe. The personal contrast between the two generals matters because it shapes how each approaches strategic questions. MacArthur has spent his entire career in positions of supreme command, where his decisions were final. He is accustomed to authority and certainty. His brilliance as strategist and his proven record of success have created supreme confidence in his own judgment. When his recommendations are questioned or rejected, he interprets this as political interference with military necessity rather than legitimate disagreement about strategy. His ego and his genuine belief in his strategic vision make it almost impossible for him to accept that he might be wrong. Bradley's career followed different path. He rose through staff positions and coalition warfare where success required compromise and consideration of factors beyond purely military effectiveness. His command of American ground forces in Europe during World War II required constant coordination with allies and subordination of American interests to coalition objectives. This experience taught him that military victory is meaningless if it undermines political objectives or destroys alliances necessary for long-term security. Bradley's temperament and experience make him capable of accepting outcomes that MacArthur finds intolerable precisely because Bradley understands that sometimes restraint serves strategic objectives better than decisive action. When Bradley testifies about MacArthur's dismissal, he does not attack MacArthur's character or question his courage. He acknowledges MacArthur's brilliance and his service to the nation, but Bradley makes clear that strategic judgment requires more than military genius. It requires understanding political context, accepting limitations, and recognizing that winning battles while losing broader strategic competition is not actually victory. MacArthur's recommendations would win in Korea while potentially losing the Cold War by triggering World War III or breaking the alliance system that contains Soviet power. Bradley's wrong war statement is not insult but strategic assessment that MacArthur's focus on Korea has blinded him to larger realities that must guide American military policy. One of the most alarming aspects of MacArthur's recommendations for expanding the Korean War is his willingness to consider using nuclear weapons. MacArthur argues that nuclear weapons are simply more powerful conventional weapons and should be available for military commanders to use when necessary. He proposes using atomic bombs against Chinese troop concentrations in Korea and potentially against bases in Manchuria. From his perspective, American possession of nuclear weapons, while China lacks them, creates decisive advantage that should be exploited rather than squandered through political timidity. Bradley and the Joint Chiefs are horrified by this approach to nuclear weapons. They understand that nuclear weapons are categorically different from conventional weapons in ways that MacArthur either doesn't grasp or refuses to acknowledge. Using nuclear weapons in Korea would break the taboo that has prevented their use since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It would establish precedent that nuclear weapons are acceptable battlefield tools rather than weapons of last resort. Most dangerously, it would occur at a moment when the Soviet Union has its own nuclear arsenal and might feel compelled to respond, potentially triggering nuclear exchange that destroys civilization. The debate over nuclear weapons in Korea reveals how MacArthur's certainty has become detachment from reality. He dismisses concerns about Soviet reaction as overblown. He argues that using nuclear weapons would shorten the war and ultimately save lives by defeating China quickly rather than fighting prolonged conventional conflict. His logic is internally consistent but operates from premises that ignore political and strategic consequences. Bradley understands that using nuclear weapons would not end the war cleanly. It would expand the war unpredictably, potentially bringing the Soviet Union into direct conflict with the United States, and would terrify American allies who fear nuclear warfare more than they fear communist expansion in Asia. When Bradley testifies before Congress, the nuclear question is discussed carefully because of classification concerns. But Bradley makes clear that MacArthur's approach to nuclear weapons represents dangerous thinking that confuses military capability with strategic wisdom. The fact that America can use nuclear weapons does not mean America should use them. The existence of overwhelming military power creates responsibility to exercise that power with restraint, not license to use maximum force for every objective. MacArthur's willingness to consider nuclear weapons in Korea demonstrates that his judgment has become unreliable on matters that affect not just the Korean War, but the survival of civilization itself. This is why Bradley supports firing MacArthur despite the political costs and despite MacArthur's legendary status. When Truman relieves MacArthur of command on April 11, 1951, the public reaction is explosive. MacArthur returns to the United States to heroes' welcome. Millions attend parades in his honor. His address to Joint Session of Congress is an emotional event where he defends his strategy and delivers his famous line that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. Public opinion polls show majority of Americans sympathize with MacArthur and disapprove of Truman's decision. The president's approval ratings collapse. For months it appears that firing MacArthur was political disaster that might destroy Truman's presidency. But Bradley's testimony provides the administration with powerful defense of its decision. His statement that MacArthur's strategy would involve America in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong enemy resonates with public as calm, military assessment rather than political attack. Bradley's credibility as military leader and his measured tone contrast with MacArthur's theatrical certainty. Over time, as the emotional intensity of the controversy fades, Bradley's logic gains acceptance. The idea that expanding the war to China would risk World War III becomes consensus view. MacArthur's position, which seemed courageous and principled when he was fired, begins to seem reckless and dangerous as Americans consider the full implications of his recommendations. The Korean War continues for 2 more years after MacArthur's dismissal, eventually ending in armistice that preserves the division of Korea near the original 38th parallel. The outcome is essentially stalemate, which from MacArthur's perspective represents failure. But from Bradley's perspective, the stalemate serves American strategic interests by preventing communist conquest of South Korea without triggering World War III. The limited objectives that MacArthur found intolerable prove sufficient to achieve core American goals. South Korea remains independent and eventually becomes democratic and prosperous. American credibility in Asia is maintained. The alliance system that contains Soviet power remains intact. These outcomes vindicate Bradley's strategic assessment that limited war for limited objectives sometimes serves national interests better than total war for total victory. MacArthur fades from public life after his dismissal, giving speeches and writing memoirs, but never again wielding the power and authority that defined his career. He remains convinced until his death in 1964 that his strategic vision was correct and that political restrictions prevented necessary victory in Korea. Bradley continues to serve as chairman of the Joint Chiefs until 1953 and later reflects on the MacArthur controversy in his own memoirs. He never expresses satisfaction at MacArthur's dismissal, but maintains that the decision was strategically necessary. The contrast between their legacies is instructive. MacArthur is remembered as brilliant but flawed general whose certainty became liability. Bradley is remembered as steady military leader whose caution and strategic wisdom prevented catastrophic escalation in Korea. What Bradley said when MacArthur pushed the Korean War too far was more than justification for firing famous general. It was statement about the limits of military power and the dangers of confusing tactical brilliance with strategic wisdom. Bradley understood that military commanders must serve political objectives rather than demanding that policy conform to military preferences. MacArthur's genius in battle did not translate into wisdom about when to fight, where to fight, or how much to risk in pursuit of victory. His inability to accept these limitations made him dangerous at moment when restraint was more important than boldness. The wrong war, wrong place, wrong time, wrong enemy statement has become shorthand for strategic mistakes that confuse activity with progress and confuse escalation with victory. Bradley meant that America's primary strategic challenge was containing Soviet power in Europe, and that getting bogged down in Asian land war against China would divert resources from that essential task. Fighting China in Korea while Soviet Union threatened Europe meant accepting enormous costs to achieve peripheral objectives while leaving core interests vulnerable. MacArthur's focus on winning in Korea had blinded him to these larger strategic realities, and his recommendations would have compounded the error by expanding the war further. The nuclear dimension of Bradley's concerns remains relevant because it established principle that nuclear weapons should not be treated as normal military tools. MacArthur's willingness to consider nuclear weapons for tactical purposes represented exactly the kind of thinking that could lead to nuclear exchange destroying civilization. Bradley's opposition helped establish norm that nuclear weapons are weapons of last resort, held in reserve as deterrent, but not deployed casually for battlefield objectives. This norm, imperfect as it has been, has contributed to the fact that nuclear weapons have not been used in combat since 1945. Bradley's strategic wisdom in opposing MacArthur's nuclear adventurism may have prevented catastrophe whose full dimensions we can only imagine. The contemporary lesson from Bradley's confrontation with MacArthur is that even brilliant military minds can be wrong when their certainty prevents them from seeing limitations of military power. MacArthur's confidence that American military superiority could resolve the Korean situation decisively ignored political, strategic, and practical realities that made his recommendations dangerous. Bradley's willingness to oppose MacArthur despite the political costs and despite MacArthur's legendary status demonstrates the courage required to say that someone admired and respected is nevertheless wrong. Sometimes the most important military decision is to not take military action. And sometimes the greatest strategic wisdom is recognizing that winning every battle is not worth risking everything else. Bradley understood this in 1951, and his understanding prevented escalation that might have triggered World War III. If you value these lessons from history about the difference between brilliance and wisdom, subscribe for more stories about the choices that shaped our world.